Would you believe me if I told you that I thought Death Valley is one of the most misunderstood national parks in the whole national park system? What do I mean by that? I guess what I mean is the National Park Service leads with this kind of hottest, driest, and lowest national park of all the national parks. And while that may be true, I think that sells Death Valley a little bit short. And that's what we're going to go into today. There are some things in this park that absolutely blew my mind, and it took me quite a while to kind of wrap my head around how beautiful and special this national park really is. Betty and I have been back from our trip to Death Valley for over a year, and it has taken me a year to kind of really figure out how I want to share this park with you guys. And that's why I'm coming to you from my garage, because it kind of took me this long to really think about the video and to share with you guys what I really thought about this gem of a national park. I could have kind of defaulted to the hottest, driest, lowest kind of thing, but that's not really what this channel is about, and that's not really my experience in this park. So hopefully in the next few minutes, I'm going to give you some insight into what my experience was like and why this park is so damn special. We entered Death Valley National Park via Highway 178. And when we came into the park and over the pass, I was absolutely stunned. The views that we were presented with right away blew up everything I thought about Death Valley. It was so different than my expectations, I had to pull over and just immediately start shooting some of this incredible landscape. So let's debunk a few myths. The first myth is hottest. Yes, absolutely, Death Valley in the summertime is an incredibly heinous and hot place. And if you go in the summer, be prepared for that. But if you have some flexibility and you can go between, say, November and April, chances are you're going to get some really nice weather. It's going to be in the 60s, the 70s, the low 80s. And yeah, it gets cold at night. The temperatures can drop below 40 degrees. But overall, being outside is extremely pleasant. Now, you don't have as much daylight, that's a fact. But when I think about being in that park, being in Death Valley in the middle of summer, I don't know that I would want to get out of my car. I don't know that I would want to go hiking. There's a lot of things that I wouldn't do because it's just so damn hot. But when it's cooler, the park is kind of welcoming and you can get outside and hike and explore. And it's not like you're getting beat down by that incredible summertime heat. One spot that has kind of stayed with me for quite a while is the Ubehebe crater. Now, the Ubehebe crater is in the northern section of the park, and it's the largest of several of these craters. And they're relatively young. They're like 2,000 years old, which is young, you know, for geological time frame. It's like just a few minutes ago, actually. And what happened was that magma from deep within the earth kind of was coming up to the surface, and it intersected with an aquifer, fresh water that was underground, and immediately turned to steam and made this huge explosion, and the crater is a result. And one of the ways I was able to kind of get away in the park was by hiking around the crater. Now, there were a fair amount of people in the parking lot, and they were kind of hanging around looking over the edge. And when I looked at this hike beforehand, I thought I would do it. I think it was 1.5 miles or 2 miles. And when I set out, very quickly, I was all alone. And being on the other side of the crater, being all alone gave it a different feeling, I guess, for me. And that's one of the ways that I would encourage you to kind of take the extra effort to do the hikes, to go to the places that maybe are just outside your comfort zone, because in doing those types of things, it really left an impression on me, and it might leave an impression on you as well. One of the things that was spinning around my head when I was there is like, who in their right mind actually came to Death Valley and settled? I mean, the Native Americans would come into the valley occasionally when conditions were right and there were certain things they needed, and then they would get out. But it was the European settlers who kind of braved these conditions. And why did they do it? Well, of course, to get rich, which I don't think anyone ever really did. One of the biggest mining operations was for borax, and there's an exhibit there in the park that you can check this out. But there are mines all over the place, and people were looking for whatever they could find. In fact, when Betty and I were out dispersed camping, we came across several abandoned mines that were boarded up, and even kind of garbage that the miners had left behind many years ago. So there is no doubt the National Park Service is absolutely right when they say Death Valley is dry, because it is super dry. There are kind of a couple of mountain ranges between the Pacific Ocean and Death Valley, and as those storms kind of go over the mountain ranges, the Sierras and the Panamots, and maybe one more range in there, I'm not sure, all that rain, the moisture out of those clouds gets squeezed out of there, and by the time it gets to Death Valley, there's nothing. But the thing that blew me away about this is when you're in Death Valley, the forces of erosion, kind of the mountains and the geologic features that are all around, it is incredible. The alluvial fans and the other kind of crevices and gullies and, dried up waterways, all of the things that are there are evident that at times there's a lot of water that rushes through Death Valley. And that just kind of like bent my head a little bit to think about over millions and millions and millions of very dry years, the weather was able to shape the landscape in the way that it has. And that really just another thing I was totally not expecting. And when I sat down and kind of took it all in and thought about it, it put me back on my heels. So one of the things that Betty and I like to do, and one of the ways that we're able to kind of get away in these areas, is do something called dispersed camping. And that is when you take your vehicle and you go kind of to more out of the way places where camping is allowed. And we rent a 4x4 Sprinter van, and that allows us to kind of tackle some more rugged roads and get into areas that we might be afraid to go to if we didn't have that 4x4. Death Valley is actually one of the only national parks, maybe the only national park, that allows dispersed camping. And what that means is you have to get a mile off of a paved road and you can pull off and camp in an area that has obviously been camped in before. So you can't just kind of randomly drive off anywhere you want. You have to find a spot. And a couple of roads require permits, but there's a lot of the park where you're able to do this. And what Betty and I find is doing this dispersed camping just takes everything down a notch. And having the peace and the quiet and the solitude really, really kind of drops me into a place that I love to be when I'm in the outdoors. It's a place of, I guess, of calmness and peace, and I love doing it.
Oh no, going down. Oh no, goes left. Also goes down.
So even after an extended period of time in Death Valley, being on the move a good part of it and hiking and seeing things, there is still a ton to see in the park, and I am definitely going to go back, and I think I'm going to try and do a little bit more hiking, but certainly at the right time of year, because at the wrong time of year, it's a really dangerous thing to do, and being prepared, man, I mean, it could go bad in a hurry. So if you're thinking about doing it, make sure you do your research and know where you're going, what you need to bring, and what the rules of survival are in Death Valley, because Death Valley, it doesn't care. let's talk about that lowest thing, that Death Valley has the lowest point in the continental United States. And I guess that's something, but on its own, it's really not that interesting. But when you're in Badwater Basin and you look across and you see the Panamint Range, and that's at 10,000 feet, and you're a couple of hundred feet below sea level, and those mountains are like, they're right there. It is incredibly dramatic, and I was absolutely not prepared for that at all. I think in my head, I had this idea of Death Valley being like the Roadrunner cartoon desert. Like, okay, maybe there are some mesas and bluffs, but it's just mostly long stretches of dusty, sandy nothing. Well, that could not be farther from the truth. There are so many beautiful things to see in this park, so many things that I just was not prepared for. Man, I tell you. We closed out our trip with 36 hours on the western edge of Death Valley National Park. We were on BLM lands up on a plateau surrounded by mountains, and it was pretty much just us. Over a 36-hour period, we saw one pair of motocross riders come tooling by. Other than that, it was us and the sagebrush and the mountains and the clouds, and it was glorious.